Today I'll be talking about tradition and modernity in contemporary China through Hanfu or Chinese clothing. The first thing I want to do is define some terms that people might not be familiar with. Tradition is the transmission of customs or beliefs from generation to generation, or the fact of being passed on in this way. Invented traditions are cultural practices that are presented or perceived as traditional, arising from the people starting in the distant past, but which in fact are relatively recent and often even consciously invented by identifiable historical actors. The Opium Wars were two wars waged between the Tang Dynasty and Western powers in the mid-19th century. The First Opium War, fought in 1839 through 1842 between the Qing Dynasty or Qing China and the United Kingdom, was triggered by the dynasty's campaign against the British merchants who sold opium in China. Modernity is the quality or condition of being modern, a modern way of thinking, working, etc., contemporariness. And Hanfu is traditional styles of clothing worn by the Han Chinese, consistent of a robe or a jacket, the upper garment, and a skirt or pants as the lower garment. Before I continue, I would like to state that I will be posting the script below in the the bio, and it will have all my resources along with footnotes. And every slide is going to have, or most of the slides are going to have a footnote at the bottom that's going to be the main resource for that page. So first, let's talk about social roles of the Hanfu and the different classes. These are mainly going to be the elite versus the non-elite. So first, we're going to be talking about the Tang Dynasty. And the Tang Dynasty was from 618 to 906. The rules were as followed. Besides regulations regarding the color, animal images such as lion, Chinese unicorn, tiger, jackal, hawk, wild goose, and so on were specifically conferred upon civilian and military officials by authority to be embroidered on their robes, which were called embroidered robes. In the Tang Dynasty, there was the rule of the wide belt. This conviction dictated that the quality and quantity of decorations on the belt be used to indicate the rank of government officials. For example, the officials lower than the first rank wore sword or knife. Officials and generals higher than the third rank wore jade belts. Officials of the fourth and fifth rank wore gold belts, and the sixth and seventh ranking officials wore silver belts. In comparison, ordinary people could only wear a small bronze or iron knife. About 3 to 4 dynasties later, there was an extreme shift in regulations of the Han clothing. This is in the Ming Dynasty, which was from 1368 until 1644. In 1368, Zhu Yuanjiang ascended the throne as Chinese emperor, founder of the Ming Dynasty. He was born a peasant. Zhu had commanded an army fighting to overthrow the Mongol Yuan Dynasty, which was the dynasty before, eventually triumphing over both the old regime and his rival rebels. Once in power, he sought to restore what he viewed as traditional Han order after nearly a century of quote-unquote barbarian rule. During his reign, he enforced many new rule changes specific to clothing and the Mongols. One of his first acts was to establish a dress code. It banned Mongol styles and dictated standards for each rank of government officials, distinguishing them from each other and from ordinary people. It also restricted what commoners could wear, enforcing the Neo-Confucian hierarchy: scholars, farmers, artisans, and merchants. The code regulated clothing materials, colors, sleeve length, headgear, jewelry, and embroidery motifs. The goal, the emperor declared, was to make the honored and the mean distinct, and to make status and authority explicit. Just because you could afford certain clothes didn't give you the legal right to wear them. The main reason the emperor instated these rules were so that the state could have total control over the country. After the Ming Dynasty came the Qing Dynasty. It's a time of a major transition between traditional and modern Chinese. through the transition, we're going to talk about the loss of Chinese sovereignty through Manchus and the British, and we're also going to talk about the continuation of tradition through Bakuya, which is a community in southern China in the mountain regions. So, the Manchus. In the early state of the Qing army's entry into the past, in order to establish the regime, they adopted extremely tough political means and emphasized that the Han people had to follow the dressing rules of Manchu. In their treatment of women, Manchus followed significantly different norms than Han. This was specifically the feet binding of the Han women. The Manchus said that they would do no such thing, such as wearing the foot bindings, but many thought it would catch on over time. There was a few people who adopted it, however, it didn't stick on long, and eventually it fell out of fashion and was banned by the Manchus. Other than this, the Hanfus were banned. They were no longer allowed to wear Hanfu clothing like in the dynasty before, in the Ming Dynasty. And they also had to change the way their hair was cut. In the bottom picture, you can see how the head was shaved and there was just a long ponytail. This is definitely part of the Manchu clothing style rather than Han Chinese. Although the Han Chinese were required to wear Manchu clothing, eventually Manchu clothing was caught on and inspired the qipao, which is technically considered the traditional clothing of China, even though traditionally speaking Hanfu should be it. Next we're going to be talking about the British. We're going to talk about the signing of Nanking in 1842, concluding the war, the Opium War. It opened Chinese ports to the British trade and it established Hong Kong as a British colony. However, this wasn't in fact long. Hong Kong is now no longer a British colony. This is the war on drugs, the Opium War. And the cause of this, I would say, would be the gap between British imports to and exports from China. They became very alarming. From 1792 to 1807, the company's shipment to England from Kenyan, which if you look in the picture on the right, you can see what Kenyan is in southern China. The shipments were worth 27,157,006 pounds, British pounds. Whereas the English exports to Kenyan came to only about 16 million pounds. The major thing about this was that tea was really the only export leaving China, whereas China didn't really need many imports from England. So instead, they used the British Indian exports, which were more so the opium. That's mainly where they got the opium from. And eventually, England wanting to be in charge, they pushed opium there. And a lot of British actually looked at it as disrespectful because the Chinese army was not strong enough to keep up with the British army. The Bakuya was in the early 1700s. Synthetic dyes were introduced by the English. These dyes caught on rather nicely due to the fact that synthetic dyes would not fade fast and had very wide range of colors, the complete opposite of natural dyes being plants. However, there are still minorities in China that practice traditional dyeing, this being the Bakuya from Guizhou and Guangxi provinces, which is lower southern mountainous China. The Bakuya still maintain the whole traditional process, including cotton planting, cotton picking, spinning, weaving, painting, dyeing, embroidery, and garment making. So they literally start from nothing and make a whole outfit. This used to be the tradition until you got synthetic dyes, and then it was just making the garment, quickly dyeing them, and they would last way longer than making a traditional Hanfu. Lastly, we're going to be looking at modernity, and this shows in multiple different ways throughout the last roughly 100 years in China. This is where we would start seeing modernity started showing up in China, was right before the Mao Zedong era, so roughly 1912. So in the 1920s was the liberation of women's public presentation, i.e. the qipao. 1980s, there was the one-child policy, which brought a better economy through more money. And then finally you get to the Han clothing reform, which was around the 2000s. So first, let's talk about 1920s and the liberation of women's public presentation. Although the qipao came around in the 1920s, they did not catch on fast in the figure-fitting form, which is the qipao you know today. The qipao translates as banner gown and was originally a long, wide, loose-fitting garment, as you can see from the pictures on the side. The legend has it that a fisherwoman, feeling hindered by the expense of materials in her dress, set to work to make it more practical and tailored a long gown with slits up each side that would enable her to tuck her dress in at the front. Following the collapse of the Tang Dynasty amid a period of great social change, women sought different clothing styles to reflect their increasing emancipation. In the 1920s, influenced by Western fashions and thoughts infiltrated Shanghai and trends involving Beijing, as well as endorsements by celebrities and the influential Song Qingling. The qipao became narrower and shorter, more revealing of the feminine form, as the pictures show on the side here, which are completely different from the qipaos before. By the 1930s, women all over China could be found wearing figure-fitting qipao. It had not only become China's national dress, but also a symbol of modernity. As I stated earlier, qipaos are based off the Manchu style, which was the last dynasty of China. And as I said before, the switch over from tradition to modernity through Western powers. We're going to take a quick look at the 1949s. This is a couple years after Mao Zedong became president of China. There was a bunch of posters around, just like this one, that quotes, "Women hold up half the sky." It promotes female labor and equality. It promotes female labor and equality through influencing, just as the poster has shown. Scholar Shui Pingzhong has proposed quotes from Mao like, "The times are different, men and women are all the same. What our male comrades can do, female comrades can do too." During the Mao era, China had one of the highest female labor force participation rates in the world because of Women's Liberation Project. This was major in China because before, Hanfu was very restricting, and it made sure that women had a quote-unquote place. They weren't allowed to own property, they weren't allowed to have their own money, just like in the US back then. But through the reform, many women were stepping up and creating a place for themselves outside of what the Hanfu was stood for, which was you could look feminine and still be strong and equal to men. So in the 1980s, the one-child policy affected China tremendously. Although this policy is not strictly enforced in some rural areas and among ethnic minorities, the average fertility rate in Chinese families dropped dramatically by 73%, from 5.73 births per woman in 1970 to 1.56 births per woman in 2014. This affected the economy due to Chinese tradition. In China, it is extremely common for parents to pay for their children's education. This is mainly because children are required to go to school until middle school. However, unlike the US and multiple other countries, in China you have to pay for a child's education. The government does not pay for you. So there was a lot of people whose family did not have money and they were unable to go to high school or even college. So when the rate dropped, the birth rate dropped, it affected the economy immensely because now not only did parents have money to send their children to higher education, they could afford anything really that their child would need. After the policy, when people were having fewer children, they noticed they had a lot more money than before, like I just said. They were able to buy stuff that they otherwise could not, like education, clothing, trips abroad, education abroad for their children. And this was very much a big mentality for Chinese, as they would rather give the most to one child rather than give average or below average to multiple children. China's middle class has grown in the past 20 years. In 2000, roughly 3% of the Chinese population was classified as middle class. By 2018, more than half of China's population, 707 million people, if you don't know, the population of China is 1.4 billion people, had entered the country's middle class bracket, according to calculations from Center of Strategic and International Studies that define the middle class as those spending between 10 to 50 US dollars a day. This is comparative to the US or US dollar. 6 yuan is 1 US dollar. So 50 US dollars is roughly going to be 130 yuan. For reference, the cost of eating out every day is roughly 125 yuan. This is about $19. Most people in the US don't necessarily eat out every day, but they eat out a lot. This is completely different to China, where they prefer homemade food. And also the fact that China pay is not as much as the US. They would make roughly, like, some of their highest income, like 18,000 yuan, which is about 6,000 US dollars. Actually, it's about 3,000 US dollars. That's one of the highest pay in the US, or in China. However, in the US, you can get like way higher. You can get like 6,000 US dollars, stuff like that. So, spending $50 a day is very average in the US, but it's not as average in China, I would say. There has roughly been a rise in the middle class purchases of traditional clothing, and the prices of Hanfu in Shanghai range anywhere from $30 to a few $1,000s. The economy rising caused a higher middle class, which causes there to be more money to buy traditional clothing, which leads me to the Han clothing movement or Han clothing reform. So this started in the early 2000s. This was when people believed that China was more modernized and didn't have much of its tradition anymore due to the colonization in the Yuan and Tang Dynasty between the Mongols, the Manchu, and the British. Around the year 2003, enthusiasts launched the Hanfu movement by wearing Hanfu attire in public, building Hanfu communities, and organizing activities around Hanfu and Chinese traditional culture. They hope to make Hanfu known as the ethnic apparel worn by Han Chinese for formal traditional ceremonies, as well as in everyday life. A newly emerging neo-traditionalist and ethno-nationalist group in contemporary urban China decided to promoting ancient ethnic clothing for the previously unmarked majority Han nationality. When it means majority Han nationality, China is roughly made up of 52 ethnicities, and the top ethnicity would be the Han ethnicity, which is roughly makes up 91 to 92% of the entire country. So that's going to be roughly a billion of the 1.4 billion people. A symptom of these tensions, the tensions of the Han nationality, within national identity and its cultural product provide fleeting cures for participants. Neo-traditionalist. It's neo-traditionalist because it is dedicated to promoting a particular vision of tradition, embodied in clothing, ritual, and accompanying lifestyles, amidst the rapid social, economic, and cultural changes in China's urban areas. The neo-nationalist. It's neo-nationalist because the tradition that it promotes is Han, which I have mentioned is a term relating to the majority nationality of 92%. And it indicates the sole, true, and eternal embodiment of authentic Chineseness. Or so it's quoted. So basically, throughout this whole time, from the very beginning, when the Yellow Emperor started wearing Hanfu, until, which was a couple, maybe like three plus thousand years ago, until now, when modern day China is wearing Hanfu, it's been a complete 360. It's more of an invented tradition now because during Mao Zedong era, there was really no one who was able to keep the tradition alive because Mao ruled for the banning, as well as the Manchus and Mongols. Whenever they took over, they banned a lot of the Hanfu. So it's changed a lot over the years, and it took a complete 360 because Hanfu used to be very traditional, but now it's turned into a invented tradition and has a modern twist on it. So a lot of clothing now, during the Hanfu clothing movement, is not going to be traditional Hanfu. They're actually going to be very much different. A lot of people mix them with qipao, or they mix them with a hanbok, which is Korean traditional clothing. They can mix it with the kimono, which is Japanese, or the lolita, which is also Japanese style clothing. Yes. So, China has changed a lot throughout the last roughly 500 years of its lifetime, especially in ways of tradition and what clothing means. And I feel like over time, it definitely changed a lot because originally, traditional Hanfu, I would say the better looking clothing was for the elite, whereas peasants or commoners, the non-elite, they were not allowed to wear what you would think of as Hanfu. They had to wear very dull colors and such. And then eventually, Hanfu fell out of style. The qipao came in, which isn't even made from the Han Chinese. It's made from the Manchus. And now back to traditional Chinese style. The Hanfu is coming back, but with different dynasties, not the Han Dynasty, but like dynasties overall are taking over again with the Han Chinese. And because this is a new movement, there's still a lot more that's going to be done. But essentially, the younger generation has started wearing Hanfu a lot more in order to touch base with their tradition, the tradition of China, and what some people think China really is.